So as far as the ERQ goes, some say it's harder, some say it's easier. I leave that decision up to you. I am going through the information right now that's in the writing workbook. This is page 6. Again, it starts with the word count, which, as I said in the previous video, don't worry too much about it. As long as you have all of the components, then you're good to go. However, it should not take you more than 50 to 55 minutes. That means that for the full hour that you have to write your ERQ, I would like for you to spend 5 to 10 minutes doing the planning and the outline, or doing like a mind map of what you want to include and what evaluation points you want to include, and then move on to writing and leave 50 to 55 minutes of writing. You are going to still have one central argument. So in this case, it is exactly the same as is in the SAR. You will also notice that the central arguments for the essay as well as the SAR are basically the same. The thing that might change a little bit is your first paragraph, which is the direct answer to the question, because you're going to sometimes use 2 studies to answer your question. Right, so the next thing that it says is 2 supporting studies. Yes, the ERQ does suggest that you should be using 2 studies to support your answer. However, some exceptions may apply. So if you are writing an essay about the role of communication in relationships, you already know that the Gottman study is so packed with details that it doesn't really matter that you only have 1 study, because there's so much stuff to talk about. Similarly, you'll see in the example that is in this workbook on the influence of neurotransmitters on behavior, that you can really write a good essay without actually writing 2 studies if you're really good at evaluating, because the evaluating is also something that's going to win you back a lot of points. However, as a rule of thumb, go for 2 pieces of studies to support your research. The main thing that's different is that the ERQ is not looking only for knowledge. So whereas the SAR was looking for, do you know your stuff? Can you provide a piece of supporting evidence? And can you explain how these 2 are interlinked? Here, the extra step that you have to do is show that you can think for yourself, and that you've actually thought about this research that you are presenting, and that you understand that it's not perfect. Because no piece of research that we are doing is perfect, which is great because it gives you a lot of stuff to talk about. Every time I say evaluation and critical thinking, if you feel lost, you can go back to MAGIC. So MAGIC meaning methodological considerations, alternate explanations, gender considerations, ethical considerations, and cultural considerations. Keep in mind, however, that considerations does not only mean picking on the crappy stuff in research. It means that anything that was a pro is also appropriate, as well as anything that the researchers did tend to and take care of is also appropriate to write about. So you're going to have an introduction, same as you did in the SAR. Alright, so now that you've done the first paragraph, I hope that you see that it's very much similar to the SAR. So when you are structuring your final essay, it's most likely going to look like this. It's going to have a first paragraph, a second paragraph, which is also the same as in an SAR, so it's going to provide context and end with a central argument. Super important, the same as in the first one. Then you're going to have a third paragraph that presents the research, number 1. You're going to have a supporting paragraph to that one that does the critical thinking and shows critical thinking after this argument that you have presented. Then you're going to do next piece of research, evaluate again, and conclude. So the thing that you are actually adding is a total of 3 paragraphs, because you're adding 1 extra study and you're adding 2 paragraphs for evaluation. And this is how this is going to be different than in the SAR. If you don't want to stick to the paragraph structure as strictly as in the SAR, no harm done. However, keep in mind that you are still getting 2 out of 22 points on the essay for clarity and organization of your response and of structuring your essay. And it's easy to get those points, however, it's also very easy to lose them. So if I feel like I have to read your essay a couple of times because you didn't use paragraphs and you kind of just blended everything in together and I can't see your arguments, that's something that makes you lose focus and lose points in the organization category. Something that you guys get confused with quite a lot is where are you actually going to have to write this ERQ, and do you get a choice of topics? So to answer that question, you are going to have one ERQ on paper 1, which is on the core topics, and you're going to have 2 ERQs on paper 2, where you're doing the options. That is, of course, for HL students only, because SL students do one option and they have one ERQ on paper 2. So if you are HL, you are writing a total of 3 of these. If you are SL, you are writing a total of 2 of these. If you are my student specifically, then you are writing one of these from one of the core topics. You are doing one of these from Human Relationships unit and one of these from Abnormal Psychology unit. In all of these 3 categories, you get a choice of question, meaning that in core, you get 3 topics to choose from: biological, cognitive, and social-cultural. In human relationships, you also get 3 topics to choose from. So group dynamics, formation of human relationships, and prosocial behavior. And in abnormal psychology, there's also 3 topics to choose from. So there's going to be one on treatment, one on diagnosis, and one on etiologies of a psychological disorder. So even though it requires more work, it's more points, and it's more effort, you're never stuck with one question, as in the case of SAR, where whatever you get is what you have to write. That also means that you're going to have to spend the first minute trying to figure out which question is good for you and which one you want to write about. But we'll get into that when we talk about exam strategies, and that's not really the important focus of structuring and answering the question, which is the focus of this video. There's another difference between the SAR and the ERQ, and that's basically the fact that in the SAR, I really don't think that it's important what the command term at the beginning of the question is, whereas in the ERQ, it actually does make a difference when you are rating. There's not a lot of them to expect, so it's easy to tell them apart. The one that I think you are most likely to receive is a question that asks to what extent. So to what extent does genetics influence behavior is a good example of that. If you get a to what extent type of question, it basically means that they want you to argue it. When you are arguing something, you aren't only presenting arguments for one side of the argument, but you're presenting arguments for both sides of the argument. This means that it's good to have a counter argument. In the case of this example, so to what extent do genetics influence behavior, your counter example could be the fact that in the Grove study, it showed that as kids matured and as they got older, the influence of genetics decreased and they became less significant compared to the environment. So you would basically explain the same study that you would usually use to show the influence of genetics on behavior to also demonstrate it as a counter argument, which is pretty neat in the case of that study. Sometimes a counter argument might mean that you're doing something completely that might seem irrelevant to the topic. So if you're saying that one of the important components of formation of relationships is biology, and the question is, to what extent do biological factors influence formation of relationships? You can do the first part of your essay about the fact that, yes, we know that there's a lot of biological factors that influence formation of relationships, and you can either choose to talk about genetics, or you can choose to talk about hormones or pheromones, whatever floats your boat. But then in the second part of your essay, you would do a counter argument and say, right, but wait, there's a lot of things that we're not taking into account if we're focusing only on biological factors. So for example, we haven't mentioned the role of culture in formation of relationships. And then you would talk about how that is also an important component and how biology alone is not enough to explain the formation of relationships. But this you would do only if you get a to what extent type of question. That's the first scenario. The second scenario is that you do a counter argument if you're stuck. And if you get a question, for example, discuss the role of culture in behavior, how culture influences behavior, and the command term is discuss, so you don't really need to do a counter argument, but you're sitting there and you're like, I don't remember anything. The only thing that I remember is culture of honor and Cohen, and that's good, but that's only one example. I don't have another study that could support because you completely blanked on everything that we did regarding culture, and that's okay. That sometimes happens. So if that's the case, then I encourage you to do a counter argument so that you save your butt, essentially, so that you show that you have some other understanding on the topic, even if it's not directly relevant. It won't be graded as high as a focused response, but it will get you more points than only focusing on one supporting evidence piece and not really getting into a deeper understanding of the topic. So that's a to what extent type of question. To what extent means you need a counter argument, and the second part of your essay is kind of arguing with the first part of your essay. You might also get a compare and contrast question, which basically means that they want you to show differences and similarities. This is more often in the options papers. So for example, when you're comparing different types of treatments for a psychological disorder, and the question is compare and contrast, then you would compare and contrast, meaning show similarities and differences of these two treatments. Other ones are evaluate. If you see evaluate, you know that you have to teacup. If teacup doesn't really mean anything to you right now, that means we haven't gotten there in the unit yet. But there's this neat strategy for evaluating theories such as social identity theory, social cognitive learning theory, that we use in order to make it easier for us to brainstorm ideas on what we can talk about when somebody asks us to evaluate a theory. Other ones, such as discuss, is fairly simple. It's just the same equivalent of an explain question in an SAR. So those are the different command terms that you can expect. You can expect to what extent, compare and contrast, evaluate, discuss, and those are basically the ones that we see repeat over and over again. That is something that I do want you to pay attention to when you are planning your ERQ at the beginning and your planning time. One more tip before we go into talking about the different example essays that have been provided in the workbook for you. I talk a lot about the importance of critical thinking and evaluation when writing the ERQ, and that is true. However, 2 points of advice. One, not all critical thinking is the same, meaning some critical thinking is more relevant than other critical thinking. If you are writing an essay about ethical considerations, then maybe talking about, let's say, the amount of control groups and how this was a good use of the experimental method, that might not be very relevant. So you might focus on different evaluation points, for example, social desirability effect and how that would influence the need for informed consent in this study, because if you explain to the participants at the start of the study exactly what the results are going to be used for and how they're going to be evaluated, they are a lot more likely to tell you the truth later on in the questionnaire. And that's just something that we know from our ethical considerations topics. So first, make sure that when you're planning your essay, you actually think about whether all of your critical thinking points that you want to talk about are relevant and interesting. So for example, if you feel like there's nothing you can say that would be interesting about ethical considerations, maybe it's not really wise to write a sentence that just says, both genders were represented in the study, period. Because that's not really interesting. That doesn't really show that you know something about critical thinking, about evaluating the study. But if you think that the question is interesting in terms of population validity, and population validity would be something that is important to discuss in this essay, then you can spend 3 sentences discussing population validity instead of adding a sentence about gender considerations that isn't really all that interesting. So choose your evaluation points wisely and make sure that your evaluation points are relevant to the thing that you are talking about. Because you can demonstrate critical thinking in many ways. So if this is an evaluate type of essay, you're already showing lots of critical thinking by evaluating the theory, so you don't need to spend a lot of time critically analyzing the studies that you are using to support. You can focus on the evaluation components rather than the magic components. The second tip about using critical thinking in your essays is this. Don't just state stuff, explain stuff. So if you are saying that, for example, Cohen's culture of honor study has poor generalizability, that's not really enough. Tell me who you are generalizing these results to and who you cannot generalize these results to and what that basically means. So you're going like a step further. Same with, a lot of you guys sometimes pick on ecological validity in a research, and that's great. That is definitely something that you can discuss. However, what are the implications of the fact that a study has low ecological validity? That basically means this. If a study has ecological validity that's crappy, that's going to mean that these results are not representative of what stuff would happen like in a real life situation. So maybe this study isn't actually very informative in terms of how this factor influences human behavior. And what could be a better improvement of the study would be conducting this in a more real life situation and not in a laboratory type of setting to see if we would also get the same results. I hope you see how that's a little bit different than just saying low ecological validity. That's it. So evaluate and do so in a way that shows the person who is reading your essay that you actually know your stuff, because then you're going to be scoring a lot of points in both knowledge and in the critical thinking criteria. Last thing, don't repeat stuff. So if you have 2 pieces of research in your essay and they both have crappy ecological validity, don't talk about it in both of the pieces. So either discuss it at the end as something that relates to both of the studies, or only discuss it in one of the studies, and in the second study find something else. So find a different way of showing that you can also evaluate the study critically. You're not going to get extra points if you're repeating the same arguments over and over for both pieces that you have presented. And then once you've done this, you're pretty much good to go in terms of preparing for the structure of the ERQ. And if you have the knowledge component and then now you have the structure component, I think you'll be fine on the mock and on the final exam. So if you have any more questions, make sure you shoot me a message on Moto, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Good luck!